Thank you, everybody, for being here today. We're about to get started. My name is Lavender. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the Marxist Unity Group, or MUG as it's called, the DSA caucus that is planning and organizing this reading group. I'm also on the National Labor Commission Steering Committee. We had over 250 people RSVP to the reading group, which is honestly insane, but amazing. And it shows how hungry people are in DSA to read more books in the Black Marxist canon and to learn more about the real history of this country, and especially the real history around Reconstruction. To help introduce that history in this text, we have a special guest on the call with us this session, Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a Marxist and a professor of history at the University of Houston. He has written dozens of books over the past 40 years, most recently Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaii Coup, and The Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin, which is the third in a trilogy of books on counter-revolutionary episodes in U.S. history, which he's written. Dr. Horne has also written several books on W.E.B. DuBois, including an encyclopedia on Du Bois in 2001 and a biography on him in 2009. Just earlier this year, Dr. Horne wrote an article in The Nation magazine called Abolition Democracy on W.E.B. Du Bois and the Making of Black Reconstruction. All this to say, we could not wish for someone more apt to speak on the counter-revolution of 1876 and this book that we are all reading together for the next 3 months. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Gerald Horne.
First of all, I'll provide a biographical capsule of Du Bois, then an appreciation of the historical significance of this magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, followed by a critique of some of the weaknesses of this book, weaknesses that were not his alone and still afflict a good deal of the U.S. left and Marxist left, speaking of the failure to engage settler colonialism and its complement dispossession of the indigenous, nor did Du Bois address sufficiently the international climate, which historically has been a prime factor, not only in shaping the destiny of enslaved Africans in Dixie, but also helping to project a progressive trajectory for the United States itself. And then if I have time in these few minutes, I'll have a critique of contemporary historiography of the United States. Now, first of all, with regard to Du Bois himself, and excuse me if you're already familiar with this history, born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868, passing away in Accra, Ghana, 1963, a graduate of the Graduate School of Harvard University, which leads to his first book and could easily be seen as his magnum opus. Speaking of the suppression of the African slave trade, you're probably familiar with Souls of Black Folk. He was a founder of the NAACP circa 1909 and also described himself or was described as a socialist of the path early on, because you may recall that he had done graduate study in Germany in the late 1890s, which at that time had probably the most advanced socialist and Marxist movement on planet Earth. He left the NAACP, or perhaps more accurately, was pushed out in 1934 over certain ideological disputes, but for our purposes, that led to his decamping to Atlanta University, where he penned the book at hand, Black Reconstruction. He returned to the NAACP in a different political climate in 1944, slated to be a kind of director of foreign affairs for the NAACP, which at that time was pursuing a more or less progressive path, or as progressive as could be attempted in the midst of Jim Crow U.S. apartheid. But by 1948, the political climate was changing once again, insofar as the United States found it difficult to win hearts and minds in rapidly decolonizing Africa and the Caribbean, as long as Black people and other peoples of color were treated so atrociously. So that leads to a Faustian bargain by the NAACP leadership, where in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, culminating, you might say, in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, recently gutted and eviscerated by the U.S. Supreme Court. But in return for such concessions, the left in the Black liberation movement, symbolized by Du Bois, were stabbed in the back and tossed overboard. Subsequent to that ouster from the NAACP in 1948, he was put on trial in the early 1950s because of his activism against nuclear weapons. By that time, he was 83. He was not convicted and then returned more or less to writing before decamping to Ghana, West Africa, circa 1961, where his job, in addition to counseling the new government of Kwame Nkrumah, was to help to shepherd into existence an Encyclopedia Africana. Du Bois passed away in August 1963 on the verge of the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King was introduced to a wider audience. And there you have a capsule summary of the life of Du Bois. Now, let me now turn to the historiographic importance of Black Reconstruction. It overthrew decades of Reconstruction historiography, Reconstruction speaking roughly of the period from 1865 to 1876, although recent scholarship has extended the outer bounds of Reconstruction. The consensus before Du Bois was that it represented a kind of mass Negro corruption and venality, a dystopian scenario captured in the early Hollywood blockbuster Birth of a Nation. The book was written propitiously in the 1930s during a rare upsurge of labor, a time when C.L.R. James, for example, was rewriting the basic narrative of the Haitian Revolution. Du Bois presents a devastating portrait of post-1776 North America, south of what is now the Canadian border. He sketches a society defined by the enslavement of Africans with, quote, Negro women as brood mares and of Black children as puppies, unquote. Du Bois writes of Louisiana controlling, quote, a regular importation of handsome colored girls for sale, unquote, bolstering a, quote, regulated system of colored common law wives, unquote. Unfortunately, like many of Du Bois's insight, this latter point has not been explored sufficiently in explicating contemporary sexual mores in the United States, although I must say it has been explored with regard to the history of the United States of America. And some of the footnotes in my book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, attest to that particular point. Assuredly, our historical sociologists need to ponder more deeply the ongoing impact of what I've just made reference to and what Du Bois in his book denoted as, quote, sexual chaos, unquote, which should reinforce the current historiographic trend of scrutinizing the means of reproduction, not just the means of production, though the current occupant of the White House, Governor DeSantis of Florida, among others, have echoed a number of historians by painting 1776 as the watershed that led to abolitionism. This was a strange abolitionism indeed, in that the number of the enslaved skyrocketed from the tens of thousands in the 1770s to the millions by 1861. And as a number of scholars have noted, was likely the major form of capital investment. Not to mention that as early as the 1790s, U.S. enslavers were captaining the slave trade to Cuba, and by the 1840s were in the lead with regard to the widest and deepest market of all, that of Brazil. Du Bois, by way of contrast, in contrast to certain research that I will not detail, assails the, quote, fetish worship of the Constitution. No more idiotic program could be laid down than to require people to follow a written rule of government 90 years old. Now, of course, we passed the 1930s mark, and there's still this fetish worship of the Constitution as embodied in this cockamamie scheme of originalism that's been adopted by a majority of the U.S. Supreme Court. As for the other element of U.S. scripture, speaking of the Declaration of Independence, Du Bois observes that as of 1776, quote, the opinion was fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race, regarded as an axiom in morals and as well as in politics, that black men had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, unquote. That's, of course, a snippet from the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which supposedly the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was meant to overturn, and which, by a slim 5-4 majority just a few days ago, the U.S. Supreme Court majority affirmed the idea embedded in the 14th Amendment, which should reveal, among other points, that originalism, to use the term describing their doctrine, only applies to the late 18th century Constitution. It does not necessarily apply to the post-1865 or Reconstruction Constitution. Du Bois adds further, quote, we must forget that George Washington was a slave owner or that Thomas Jefferson had mulatto children, unquote. Herein, Du Bois anticipates contemporary critiques of the Enlightenment, so-called, by Kehinde Andrews of the UK, the late philosopher Charles Mills, and others, who have pointed to this ideological intervention known as the Enlightenment as not necessarily being enlightened as far as Africans were concerned. And I should add, given the current political moment, that there has been insufficient attention to the concept that the United States, coming into being post-1776, was constructed explicitly as a so-called white republic. Now, some of you may be familiar with the work of the late UCLA scholar Alexander Saxton in his book, The Rise and Fall of the White Republic. And there have been other streams of literature in that vein. In my book on the roots of settler colonialism, the 17th century, I write, quote, the enslaved, a peculiar form of capital encased in labor, represented simultaneously the barbarism of the emergent capitalism along with its productive force, unquote. Du Bois writes likewise in observing that, quote, the South had built an oligarchy similar to the colonial imperialism of today, erected on cheap colored labor and raising raw material for manufacture, unquote. For those who harbor the illusion that the South alone was responsible for this degradation, Du Bois counters by noting that the United States then was not unlike apartheid South Africa, a kind of historical comparison that demands more work. He writes, quote, in 1865, Wisconsin had rejected a proposal to let Negroes vote. Minnesota the same year had defeated a constitutional amendment giving Negroes the suffrage. Connecticut also in 1865 gave a majority of 6,272 against Negro suffrage. Later in 1867, Ohio defeated suffrage by 50,629. In the Nebraska Constitution of 1866, only whites were allowed the suffrage, while in Georgia, the 14th Amendment was rejected in 1866 unanimously. Du Bois could have written that what was described as abolition and the abolitionism of the incipient United States, such as Vermont in the late 18th century or Oregon in the mid-19th century, was actually part of a longer history that sought to oust Negroes altogether from these shores, in pursuit of the white republic, in other words, a trend that extended to the sainted and vaunted Lincoln, who negotiated seriously in seeking to deport us all to Brazil or Hispaniola before being stymied, then promptly evolving in a manner held by so many scholars today, who almost instinctively expressed a kind of left-wing white nationalism. Of course, this trend did not extend to the late Black writer Lerone Bennett, perhaps our leading late 20th century Black public intellectual from his perch at Ebony magazine, as his example and that of today's Nicole Hannah-Jones reminds us that for the foreseeable future, we can expect historiographical progress from journalists, more so than historians, Although I must make a footnote here and single out the late dean of the graduate school at Fordham University in New York City, speaking of Tyler Stovall in his last book, White Freedom, which grapples with many of the issues raised by Du Bois, for example. As such, as Du Bois writes, the South, headquarters of enslavement, had chosen 11 out of 16 presidents, 7 out of 28 judges of the U.S. Supreme Court, 14 out of 19 attorney generals, 21 out of 33 House speakers. The South dominated the Army and Navy, which paid handsome dividends in the early stages of the Civil War. And as today's conversation drifts towards yet another Civil War, as foreshadowed by certain unnamed members of Congress, this critical factor is yet to be eliminated. Consequently, Du Bois invokes the now infamous cornerstone speech of the vice president of the so-called Confederate States of America, that is to say, quote, our new government, the first in the history of the world, based upon the great immortal truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, unquote. Of course, he could have cited the influential 752-page book by Edward Pollard, author of the still cited text, The Lost Cause, penned in 1866, which suggested that Confederate defeat settled only the issue of Union and abolition, but not Negro equality nor Negro suffrage. And the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1865, the evisceration of affirmative action, the proliferation of white nationalism, white Christian nationalism, like a fungus across the land, suggests that Pollard sensed the underlying forces driving this nation in a more astute manner than some of today's supposed sophisticated analysts. Herein, Du Bois invokes a concept that has been sharply criticized, speaking of a general strike of the enslaved, although some suggest that he should have written a successful wildcat strike. Although I must say, in thumbing through the papers of Jefferson Davis, the former leader of the so-called CSA, there are numerous examples of runaway Africans from Dixie, which enormously complicated the political economy of the Confederate States of America. Du Bois writes, quote, the Negro occupied the center of the stage because of very simple reasons. The war was in the South, and in the South were almost 4 million slaves and 261,000 free Negroes, unquote. In some ways, this sentence anticipates Du Bois' influential essay, The African Roots of War, which suggested that World War I itself was grounded in contestation over the destiny of African colonies, principally in the conflict between London and Berlin. And it also anticipates the recent work of the British scholar William Pettigrew and his book Freedom's Debt, which suggests that control of the trade in enslaved Africans was at the root of the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 in London, and likewise at the root of the Counter-Revolution of 1836 in Texas, yet another secessionist enterprise. Indeed, following Trinidad's Eric Williams, Guyana's Walter Rodney, and Nigeria's Joseph Inokore, it is not difficult to argue that for centuries, enslavement of Africans laid the foundation for the rise of capitalism itself, with resultant sharp conflict involving class struggle by these unpaid workers and tussles between and amongst Europeans for control, or certain Europeans, for control of the filthy lucre generated. Similarly, Du Bois spoke movingly of the 200,000 Negro soldiers, quote, whose evident ability to fight decided the war, unquote. He could have, of course, had a footnote where he could have drawn an analogy between 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, that war-fighting measure, and 1775, when Lord Dunmore, the last colonial governor of Virginia, formed his so-called Ethiopian regiments comprised of enslaved Africans, which some have suggested helped to trigger many settlers to join the revolt led by the enslavers, spearheaded by George Washington. Again, Du Bois could have digressed to discuss the Africans from Canada and elsewhere who broke the back of enslavement, arms in hand, not to mention the Africans who were brought to the southwest portion of North America by the French, who controlled Mexico through Appomattox to ensure that slavery persisted. Du Bois in these paragraphs alludes to the importance of London and Europe in deciding this conflict, writing reaction to emancipation in the North was unfavorable. Only amongst Negroes and in England was the reaction favorable and both counted, unquote. He could have added, of course, the role of Russia, which sent its fleet to both the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast, and then, in a remarkably boneheaded maneuver, sold its claims to Alaska for a pittance to Washington in 1867. This points up another critique of this estimable work, i.e., given Du Bois's roots in the Caribbean and given his subsequent joining the U.S. Communist Party, which argued that the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 ignited a general crisis of capitalism that could only be resolved with its collapse. It's surprising that in this work, more attention is not paid in these pages to the Haitian Revolution, which some subsequent scholars have argued ignited a general crisis of slavery, not least in the United States itself, that could only be resolved with its collapse, especially by dint of the de facto alliance that developed between London and Haiti in the immediate prelude and aftermath of British abolitionism in the 1830s. Similarly, Du Bois would have provided a service to historiography if he had stressed more the profundity of one of the most significant and sizable expropriations of private property in history to that point, which generated uncontrollable fury. Speaking of the uncompensated expropriation of slave property, which contributes to a carnival of bestial lynching, and to this day marks the descendants of the enslaved. And one could also make an argument that the potency of anti-communism in this country, marked once again on July 4th, a scant week ago, by Mr. Trump, when he rails against communists, by which I think he's making veiled reference, or not so veiled reference, to the Democratic Socialists of America. The point being that socialism historically has been associated with uncompensated expropriation of private property, not unlike what befell the enslavers in 1865 and thereafter. To his credit, albeit prematurely as it pertains to the United States, Du Bois unfurls his socialist flag, writing, quote, "It is quite possible that long before the end of the 20th century, the deliberate distribution of property and income by the state on equitable and logical basis will be looked upon as the state's prime function," unquote. And of course, in the age of AI, that particular sentence has notable relevance. To his credit, and following Lerone Bennett and Britain's Sebastian Page, Du Bois underscores the attempt by the Lincoln regime to follow emancipation with colonization, sending Negroes to the Caribbean or Brazil. There was even talk, according to Page, of Australia and Cyprus, among other places. Du Bois writes, quote, "At the beginning of the war, not one white American in 100 believed that Negroes could become an integral part of American democracy. When Lincoln died, Irish organizations refused to allow," end quote, "Negroes to march," and quote, "the Common Council of New York City refused to allow Negroes in the Lincoln funeral procession." Du Bois also addresses one of the most important elements of settler colonialism, a term still conspicuously absent from discourses on the U.S. left, although for some reason it's applied to historic Palestine, speaking of class collaboration. Quote, "Planners united in secret organizations with poor whites determined to reduce the labor vote by disenfranchising the Negro," unquote. Later he writes, quote, "White laborer joined the landowner and capitalist and beat the black laborer into subjection through secret organization and the rise of a new doctrine of race hatred," unquote. Reconstruction, quote, "by uniting the planter and the poor white, the theory of race was supplemented by carefully planned and slowly evolved methods which drove such a wedge between the white and black workers, creating a psychological wage," his term, not mine, "for the former." In a sense, Du Bois could be seen as a parent of whiteness studies, this militarized identity politics, which reached its zenith in the United States of America, and of course has been subject to enormously significant and profound scholarship of late. Understandably, Du Bois adopts a materialist conception, quote, of race hatred, unquote, noting that in 1918, quote, in order to win the war, we had to make Germans into Huns. In order to win, the South had to make Negroes into thieves, monsters, and idiots, unquote. Though the United States is replete with so-called class warriors, they have not done a good job of explicating class collaboration amongst European settlers. The essence of settler colonialism stretching back to the first London settlement in what they called North Carolina in the 1580s, collaboration for mutual advantage, including seizure of the land of the indigenous and exploitation of the free labor of the enslaved. By the same token, the class of unpaid workers often railed against the idea of collaboration with their exploiters. As is well known, the black population were more prone to fight against George Washington than to fight alongside George Washington. And then during the round two of this epical conflict, speaking of the War of 1812, when the Redcoats torched Washington, D.C., sending James Madison and his girlless spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse, the Redcoats were joined by the enslaved who fled on British vessels to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continued to reside. In a complicated manner, descendants of the enslaved often have found it necessary to ally with the real or imagined foes of settlers, be they in Texas or be they in other parts of the United States of America. This tendency has withered of late, not least because of the Compromise of 1954, of which Du Bois was a primary victim, which extended anti-Jim Crow concessions in return for marginalizing the internationalists amongst us, especially Du Bois. Then the rise of the Black Panther Party by the late 1960s revived this trend, but alas, they fell victim to bloody repression and political errors, which I can talk about at length if anyone is interested. A major contradiction between settlers and the enslaved, including their descendants to this very day, is this question of class collaboration versus class struggle. Again, I'm speaking of broad trends. I'm not seeking to suggest that Clarence Thomas is enmeshed in class struggle. Indeed, unless Black intellectuals and organizations alter their present course, they will find that their association, even incidentally or coincidentally, with class struggle will be detrimental and punishing, as the settlers veer once more to class collaboration, which we saw in November 2024 with Donald J. Trump receiving 77 million votes and the subsequent attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, and giving a pass to Mr. Trump's questionable self-dealing, manipulating the market, Elon Musk becoming a trillionaire on paper, etc. That does not seem to occupy the attention of many in the Trump base as much as attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, and affirmative action. Du Bois, who had been exposed to the most sophisticated socialist movement globally in 1890s in Berlin, does not tease out this point, which shines a floodlight on today's reality. I go on to talk about, for example, what I thought he could have paid more attention to the indigenous question, because one of the salient aspects of the Reconstruction period was an acceleration of the dispossession of the indigenous. And, but as I noted in my introductory remarks, this flaw in Du Bois's thinking is not his alone, which suggests that this was not necessarily a personal demerit, but perhaps a flaw in a larger left-wing discourse. So this time I'll stop for good.
Thank you very much for the speech. It was very good. I was wondering, reading your piece made me think about the time that Black Reconstruction came out in, and I know that it came out at the same time as the Communist Party of the United States was starting to engage in farmer and labor organizing in the South. And I was wondering if there was a relationship between those in the eyes of those organizers, if you know anything about, because it does seem, as someone who has been in the socialist movement for a decade, I could absolutely see that there were if there was someone who picked up the book and read it and then decided, okay, I'm going into the South to organize sharecroppers. But did that actually happen? Is there any kind of story of that?
Well, as you probably know, before he joined the Communist Party in 1961, uh, relations between Du Bois and communists were not ideal, shall we say. Uh, Many of them, as my remarks quoting him, and perhaps my remarks quoting myself, tend to suggest, were not that upbeat about the Euro American working class, settler descendant working class, to use the phrase that I've used. And it's understandable why in the 1930s, during the Great Labor Upsurge, the rise of the CIO, for example, that communists were taking a much more upbeat position. I think that if there was any era, it was seeing the CIO experience as not necessarily being emblematic of class relations, class struggle in the United States writ large, particularly over its 250-year history. And it is certainly probable that individual communists paid attention to Black Reconstruction. And certainly Du Bois paid attention to the rise of the CIO and paid attention to communist struggles in this country. But more than that, I cannot add.
I am curious about this historical reality that the power of the South and slavery was not limited to the South and shaped Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction politics across the U.S., very similar to the contemporary impact of GOP/Tea Party/MAGA politicians on the U.S. Can you speak more to the economic and political influence the South possessed over all of the U.S.?
Well, that's a verity of U.S. politics. One need look no further than the former Confederate States, represented by Ted Cruz, for example, represented by Roger Wicker. Although I must say, I must footnote what I've just said, because I'm doing a project now on Leo Frank. You might recall that he was the Jewish man who was lynched in Georgia circa 1915. And so I delve deeper into Georgia history. And of course, if you look at contemporary Georgia, it's represented by Ossoff and Warnock, for example. And so I think that even with regard to Dixie and the stranglehold that it has had on U.S. politics, going back to Congressman Rankin in Mississippi and Senator Bilbo from Mississippi and James Eastland and John Stennis and the other members of the Rogue Gallery, we should not pay attention to these deviations from that overall trend, which brings me to another point. I'm sure we have writers and scholars in the audience. And in doing this Leo Frank case, I've also been looking at Tom Watson, who in many ways beat the drum for the lynching of Leo Frank, and then was rewarded by being elected to the U.S. Senate. But one of the things that strikes me about Tom Watson, I know about C. Van Woodward's biography of him, but I think it needs to be updated. Because here's a tip. You can probably find online Tom Watson's book on socialism and socialism. And I would say that anti-communism has not really deviated that far from what Tom Watson wrote over a century ago. So that's my own personal pitch that I make for a new study of Tom Watson, for example. Notoriously known as the populist who shifts to the right and becomes a leader of lynch mobs. But with regard to Amani Harmon's point, obviously it's well taken. I oftentimes quote the reality in Louisiana that a few decades ago, a Nazi and a Klansman, David Duke, won a majority of the Euro-American vote running for governor in the early 1990s, for example. And that particular factoid, I'm afraid to say, is symbolic of politics in Dixie.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Horne. So my question is, would you say that Black Reconstruction marks the moment when the Black radical tradition becomes fully articulated as both a historical method and a political project, or do you locate that tradition elsewhere?
It's a good question. I do not quarrel with the premise of your question, in part because some who have been incorporated into the Black radical tradition begun to have questions about. For example, Frederick Douglass, who I think did not pay sufficient attention to the global correlation of forces. But on the other hand, before Frederick Douglass, there's David Walker. And it's difficult to quarrel with what he posted in the 1830s, for example. So, yes, you could make a signpost of Du Bois's Reconstruction with regard to the flourishing of the Black radical tradition, but that should not allow us to ignore David Walker, nor should it allow us to de-internationalize the question by ignoring Toussaint, for example, or to go back a few centuries, ignoring the Africans who rebelled against enslavement in today's Iraq approximately 1,200 years ago. An advertisement in a few weeks, actually by July 21st, my next book will be out, which deals with slavery and the slave trade heading north to Egypt and east across the Red Sea, also to Iraq. And as I point out, and others have pointed out, you had an African slave trade heading east well before the Atlantic slave trade, for example. And there was a major titanic revolt of the enslaved in what is now Iraq. It was at the end of the 9th century, as I recall, but it's in the book.
I will be picking it up. Thank you.
I'm a novice to Marxist analogists, so I apologize if my question may be a bit simplistic. But why is it that so many of us Marxists consider Russia to have the first proletarian revolution in 1917, when Haiti reigned victorious against the French criminals who had been exploiting them? It's a very good question. And I think it's a charge to many of us in the United States in particular. To that point, let me say, I do these interviews on KPFK, the Pacifica station in Los Angeles. And about a week, actually July 4th, I interviewed Jeremy Popkin of the University of Kentucky, and who has a book out, The First Emancipation, which deals with the fact that a few years after the 1789, the onset of the French Revolution, France not only abolished slavery, but incorporated Black people into the parliament and incorporated Black people as citizens. And of course, Napoleon sought to overthrow that historical trajectory, not unsuccessfully. But I think that speaks to the point you oftentimes hear from U.S. patriots, which is that abolition per the United States was premature. Well, it wasn't premature in France, which means that it was not necessarily premature in this country as well. But Mr. Franz Blau's point is well taken, and I look forward to it being expanded upon.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. I'd like to synthesize two questions that I'm seeing here. One, if you could talk more to the Indigenous question, the suppression and attacks upon Indigenous people. If you could also then talk about how this relates to the ongoing oppression of Palestinian people that we're seeing today.
Well, as I had suggested in my opening remarks, the term settler colonialism, speaking broadly of the U.S. left, is more likely to be applied to historic Palestine than North America. And given the way things are going politically, I'm surprised Israeli patriots have not accused the U.S. left of anti-Semitism, in the sense that they use a descriptor to apply across the Atlantic, but not necessarily on these shores. I think in the Nation piece, unless they edited it out, I'm not sure if they did, that you could draw a parallel between these various settler regimes, be they in North America, be they in the United States in particular, I would say. Historic Palestine, South Africa, Kenya, Algeria, the settlers' revolt that preceded independence in 1962, for example. And in about 6 months, I'll publish a book which deals largely with the indigenous question of what is now the U.S. Pacific Northwest, the states of Oregon and Washington, for example. And then I'm contrasting it with British Columbia and Canada and the policies that were pursued there. And to the end of that book, at the end of that book, I make a critique of a well-known, celebrated song from the U.S. left. This land is your land, this land is my land. Actually quoted by Tom Friedman of the New York Times just a few days ago, which it seems to me does a poor job of confronting settler colonialism, to put it mildly.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. Could you speak to this question of class collaborationism? I'll read out the question, and I think this is a large theme in the work. There are alliances that we would want to be made but aren't made, and alliances that are made that we wouldn't want to be made. The question is, what are socialists in the U.S. to do about the structural hurdles of class collaboration between U.S. citizens in shared exploitation of others, a fact that goes back to the founding? How do we clear that hurdle in the present day?
Well, it's going to be a very difficult hurdle, but it seems to me the first point is to acknowledge it and to recognize it. I've said that with regard to the unpaid sector of the working class and their descendants, internationalism, lengthening the battlefield, was part of the way that class collaborationism was confronted with regard to the paid sector, the wage labor sector of the working class, for example. I mentioned the Haitian Revolution, the alliance with the socialist camp in the 20th century, for example. You notice that in my remarks, I mentioned Maine, and obviously the reference is obvious in terms of what I'm referring to. But I think that bespeaks part of this problem, because many in our movement feel they don't acknowledge class collaboration. They feel the problem is you just need there's sort of affirmative action for Euro-American workers, even if they have certain, shall we say, chinks in their armor. And then it leads, not unpredictably, to this chaos and disaster in Maine. But I would just conclude by saying, A, it's a difficult hurdle to surmount, but the first step is acknowledging it. We need more writing about it. We need more analysis of it. And B, I think an antidote to class collaborationism is internationalism. I would like to see, say, for example, with regard to DSA, that they have more ties, for example, with the NDP, the New Democratic Party across the border in Canada, which has been ruling British Columbia periodically for decades now. Not to mention other like-minded comrades. I mean, what do they plan to do about the upcoming French elections and the Mélenchon movement, for example? Will Mélenchon and his surrogates be invited to the United States to speak about their experience and building a left-wing alternative? I mean, I could go on in this vein, for example.
Could you speak, Dr. Horne, to what impact Black Reconstruction had on later political movements? So groups that were organizing, movements that were organizing after the book was published in the 1930s. How was the work taken up by folks?
Well, I would say that it takes a while for the historiographical import of Black Reconstruction to be absorbed, not least because of the strength of the right in this country. You could make an argument that its importance is signaled when in 1988, Eric Foner of Columbia writes his book on Reconstruction, which in many ways is an updating of Du Bois's work, and then updated further by Manisha Sinha of the University of Connecticut, in her recent book, which, as I suggested, expands the boundaries of Reconstruction past 1876 up to women's suffrage in the early stages of the 20th century, for example. So I would say that Black Reconstruction has had a mixed reception, beginning in the 1930s, but certainly by the 1980s is regarded as a consensus.
Manisha Sinha, I will say, has a great interview with Class, which is the podcast of DSA, so folks can check that out. Could you talk, Dr. Horne, about the sources that Du Bois is using and how this work is both, of course, a work of history, telling the audience about history as it happened, but it's also a political intervention. This is not a neutral telling of these events.
Well, with regard to the sources, the late John Hope Franklin spoke for many Black historians when he talked about Jim Crow in the archive. That is to say, when Du Bois was doing his research, generally speaking, it was not possible to visit archives, particularly in the South, for example. So he has to rely heavily on published documents. He has to rely heavily on memoirs, newspapers, for example, congressional documents. And you see that if you were to compare the sources that Foner relies upon in the 1980s, and of course, Foner's not Black, the sources that he relies upon were his 1988 book, which is heavily embedded in primary sources in the archive, as opposed to the sources that Du Bois has to rely upon. Du Bois might say that any scholar writing history is a Politico, whether they acknowledge it or not. I mean, if you write a book, as some have suggested, saying that the Constitution is an abolitionist document, well, that's a political statement. Just as if you're Du Bois and you fundamentally lambaste the Constitution and lambaste the concept of what he calls fetish worship of the Constitution. That is to say, he comes out of the movement. He comes out of the socialist movement. He comes out of the Black liberation movement. He comes out of a Black left movement. For example, his fellow scholars at Howard University, Abram Harris, for example, William Leo Hansberry, for example, E. Franklin Frazier, for example. So that is the milieu which helps to create the Black Reconstruction and Du Bois himself.
Could you speak, Dr. Horne, to the suppression of movements? A question here is asking about COINTELPRO and if there's any comparison between the state-sponsored suppression of movements later in the 20th century, and I know you've recently written about COINTELPRO in one of your recent books, and then the suppression of Reconstruction, the overthrow of Reconstruction. Can we draw any parallels? Would you like to bring those together?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, the overthrow of Reconstruction was quite bloody. I was just in Louisiana a few days ago talking to some of the friends there about the Colfax Massacre, for example, and which was a gigantic step towards overthrowing Reconstruction in Louisiana. You mentioned, I take it, my book, Armed Struggle with a Question Mark, which deals with the Panthers in Southern California. You probably know about the Panthers and what happened on December 4th, 1969, when Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, in the wee hours of the morning, were killed, fundamentally assassinated. There's still Panthers in prison today because of the dirty tricks played upon them by COINTELPRO and like-minded movements by the state. So yes, there is a parallel between the overthrow of Reconstruction in the 19th century and the, shall we say, diminishing of the Black Panther Party in the late 20th century.
If you could really speak briefly, Dr. Horne, about the U.S. education system's obfuscation of the freedmen's role and leadership in the Civil War and Reconstruction, particularly the K-12 curriculum.
Well, I think it's called the Howard Zinn Project. I get emails from them all the time, and they're often, you recall, I'm sure, Howard Zinn, the late historian from Boston, the People's History of the United States, his signature work. and his comrades and friends are carrying on his legacy. And they oftentimes rail against K through 12 teaching, for example, not only in the vein that the commenter is suggesting, but in various veins. The fundamental problem, Mr. Trump's recent forays helped to illustrate this with his attacks on the Smithsonian, for example, is there is this felt need to construct the United States as a shining city on the hill. But that's difficult to do given dispossession and genocide against the indigenous, mass enslavement of the Africans. And so what you do is you sweep the latter under the rug so you can continue to prattle and prate about the shining city on the hill. And fortunately, we have in the teachers' unions, which represent many K through 12 teachers, you have many advocates of an accurate telling of the story of this country, which is one of the reasons they come under such heavy assault, particularly in the South, once again, in Florida and in Texas, most notably.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for your questions.